The cold came first. 40 degrees below zero, wind that sliced through parkas and tents. Canteens froze solid, engine oil turned to sludge, bandages became stiff as boards in seconds. Into this frozen landscape, in the mountains of North Korea, thousands of soldiers on both sides were ordered to advance. American Marines and Army troops pushing toward the Chinese border. Chinese People's Volunteer Forces slipping through the hills at night to stop them. The place was a man-made lake called the Chosin Reservoir. By December 1950, it would be remembered by another name, the Frozen Chosin. For those who survived, it was a campaign that felt like frozen hell. The Korean War had begun just months earlier, in June 1950, when North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel and nearly drove South Korea into the sea. A hastily assembled United Nations force, led by the United States, fell back to a small perimeter around the port of Busan. Then, in September, General Douglas MacArthur launched a bold counterstroke, an amphibious landing at Incheon behind North Korean lines. The move worked. UN forces broke out, retook Seoul, and drove the North Korean army north in disarray. As autumn turned to winter, victory seemed within reach. MacArthur ordered a general advance toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. His troops were told they'd be home by Christmas. But China watched these developments with alarm. A hostile army on its frontier was unacceptable to Chairman Mao and his commanders. Quietly, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu at night, moving into the mountains of North Korea in secrecy. Their goal was not just to defend the border, but to crush UN forces advancing too far north. In eastern Korea, the U.S. 10th Corps, centered on the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division, moved along rugged roads toward the Chosin Reservoir. These units were spread over long distances, tied to a single narrow road that snaked through high ridges and steep valleys. The countryside offered little shelter from wind or temperature. In maps in distant headquarters, the advance looked manageable. On the ground, it meant foxholes that froze solid overnight. By late November 1950, Marines at the village of Udumni on the west side of the reservoir and soldiers on the east side still believed they faced only scattered North Korean remnants. Patrols reported signs of something more: sudden contacts with unfamiliar troops, bugle calls at night in the hills, prisoners who claimed entire Chinese armies were already in Korea. Many of these warnings were dismissed. On the night of November 27th, the truth arrived. As darkness fell and temperatures plunged to life-threatening lows, Chinese forces launched coordinated attacks all around the reservoir. These were battle-hardened troops of the Chinese 9th Army Group, moving mostly on foot, lightly equipped but used to the cold. They used the terrain, ridges, draws, and frozen riverbeds to slip close to UN positions before opening fire. At Udumni, Marine outposts were hit first, then the main perimeter. On the east side of the reservoir, Army units were scattered and less prepared, some in exposed positions along a single road. In places, Chinese waves crashed into thin defensive lines. In others, infiltrators slipped between units, cutting communication and isolating companies. The fight quickly became a test not just of tactics, but of endurance. Rifles and machine guns jammed as lubricants thickened. Mortar rounds and artillery shells sometimes failed to explode after burrowing into frozen ground. Frostbite stalked foxholes and gun pits. A bare hand on metal could stick and tear skin. Yet both sides kept fighting. Chinese troops marched at night with straw shoes and quilted uniforms, carrying their own rations and extra ammunition. Marines and soldiers, many World War II veterans, dug defensive positions as best they could and called in close air support by day. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, realized that his units were in danger of encirclement. Rather than pushing farther north as ordered, he focused on holding key points and keeping the road south open. At Hagaruri, near the reservoir's southern tip, engineers and Marines scratched an airstrip out of the frozen ground, a decision that would prove vital for evacuating wounded and bringing in supplies. On the east side of the reservoir, the situation deteriorated more quickly. Elements of the 31st Regimental Combat Team, spread out and lacking strong defensive works, were hit hard from several directions. Cut off from the main force, many would fight desperate actions just to avoid annihilation, with only fragments eventually making it to friendly lines. At Udam-ni, after days of repeated attacks, Smith chose a course of action that has become legendary. He would not call it a retreat, he would call it attacking in another direction. The plan was to consolidate his scattered units and fight his way south down the single mountain road to the port of Hungnam, bringing out as many men, vehicles, and wounded as possible. The withdrawal was not a panicked flight, it was a fighting breakout. Marines advanced by day, attacking and clearing high ground on both sides of the road, while engineers and army units kept the route passable across blown bridges and icy grades. At night they dug in tightly around their vehicles, repelling renewed Chinese assaults in the bitter cold. C-119 and C-47 aircraft dropped supplies and ammunition by parachute, sometimes landing bundles within yards of frontline positions. F-4U Corsairs and other aircraft from the Marines and Navy roared overhead in daylight, bombing and strafing ridgelines and roadblocks that threatened the column. One of the most critical points came at Funchalen Pass, where the road crossed a deep gorge on a high concrete bridge. Chinese forces had blown out spans of the bridge, hoping to trap the entire division north of the gap. In a feat of improvisation and engineering, the U.S. Air Force dropped prefabricated steel bridge sections by parachute. Under enemy fire and in freezing wind, engineers anchored these panels to the remaining piers, splicing together a workable crossing. Tank after tank, truck after truck rumbled carefully over the makeshift bridge, the lifeline of the entire retreat. As the column crawled south, Chinese units paid their own terrible price. They had marched into the fight with limited winter gear and stretched supply lines. Casualties from cold and hunger mounted alongside battle losses. What had been envisioned as a decisive trap became, for many Chinese soldiers, a deadly ordeal in its own right. By December 11th, the last major Marine and Army elements fighting down from Chosin reached the Hungnam perimeter on the coast, a ring of defenses protecting a makeshift port. From there, one of the largest evacuations of the war took place. Ships carried out not only tens of thousands of UN troops, but also nearly 100,000 Korean civilians who feared reprisals if they stayed behind. Loaded freighters and troop ships steamed away from a harbor ringed with demolitions. As the last vessels cleared, ammunition dumps and remaining installations were blown up to deny them to the enemy. The Chinese claimed victory at Chosin. They had forced a UN withdrawal from northeast Korea and inflicted heavy losses on Marine, Army, and Allied units. Strategically, the UN front lines were pushed back south of the 38th parallel, and the dream of reuniting Korea under non-communist rule had vanished. The UN, and especially the Marines, claimed their own kind of victory. A surrounded force had broken out under severe conditions, brought out the bulk of its wounded and equipment, and inflicted enormous casualties on the attackers. The 1st Marine Division remained a fighting formation, not a destroyed one. For the soldiers and Marines who had been there, debates over who won mattered less than the memories. They remembered frozen rations and frozen feet, rifles fired until the bolts could barely be worked, and nights when the perimeter seemed to shrink under the pressure of bugles and shouted attacks in the dark. They also remembered moments of cooperation. Army, Marine, British Royal Marines, South Koreans, and others sharing the same foxholes and columns in a shared struggle to get out alive. For Chinese veterans, the campaign was likewise etched in memory as a crucible of sacrifice. Long marches, thin clothing, and orders to keep attacking even as frostbite and hunger chewed through units. In the larger course of the Korean War, Chosin marked a turning point. The UN offensive to the Yalu was over. The war would settle into a grinding conflict near the original divide between North and South Korea, ending 3 years later in an armistice rather than a decisive victory for either side. The Chosin Reservoir campaign also offered enduring lessons about the risks of overextension into harsh terrain, about the impact of weather on modern warfare, and about how morale, leadership, and logistics can mean the difference between complete disaster and a fighting withdrawal. Today, the mountains around the reservoir are quiet. Snow still falls on the ridges that once echoed with artillery and bugle calls. On clear days, the frozen waters reflect the sky that bombers and transport planes once crossed. The men who survived Chosin often said they just did their jobs, one step at a time, one ridge at a time, one painfully cold night at a time. But their march out of that frozen hell has become one of the defining stories of the Korean War, a reminder that sometimes not being destroyed, bringing your people home through impossible conditions, is itself a kind of victory, paid for in ice, courage, and lives on both sides of the line.